All right, we'll call to order the committee of full meeting at 5:37. Welcome, everybody. First up, the good of the order. Anything, any council members have to do with the order? No? All right, we'll move on to our first item, which is our building code update with our building official, Brian Keller, and Director of Community Development, Director Thomas.
I pretend my computer's protesting. Apparently it doesn't want to work. It's,
Are we on?
we are.
Oh, okay.
I just.
Oh, but the screen, I see.
I should give it a second and then we'll pull up the presentation. If I have to, I will log in. I can always share it too.
I have it ready. I just don't understand why the camera's not working. It is on.
Oh, the room camera, the owl.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's not. It's so right.
Just staring at like.
No, it's not.
We might have to review it.
Sometimes better than only solution. And then fully hard to restart.
Let me, I'm just gonna text. I'm gonna text Brian and.
My husband was like, not a solution for tech things.
Brian, can you hear us?
Yeah, I hear you guys.
Okay. We're trying to get the video to work, so just give us a couple minutes, okay?
Okay.
Oh, so get we do need to. Like this. We can talk after about it. I know a little bit about it, I know, no, I agree. Yeah.
No, that's that one. He hasn't recognized the owl yet. Yeah,
She doesn't have this.
That's the one that will exist. She can only be able to.
It's obviously. Good, there we go, all right. We are ready now, I think. You guys good to go then?
Brian, just to check, you share screen.
Yeah, I just sharing screen right now. Mhm. Is everyone able? Are you able to?
Go ahead, thanks for
Okay.
taking.
All right, sorry about that. Thank you. Okay. All right. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Brian Kaler, building official, and tonight's presentation going over the 2021 major code updates from the ICC with state building amendments. So for the agenda for tonight, I'll go over a little bit of an introduction of the codes. I did provide that in the staff report, more in depth introduction to what are the codes and the history behind them. We'll touch base on significant code changes to the 2021 with state amendments as they pertain to the city of Duval. We're not going to go through all of them, the major code updates for them, just the ones that would really affect Duval for the IBC, the IRC, the IFC, and then we'll go over the new code that has been adopted. It's called the WUI, which is the International Wildland Urban Interface Code. And then we'll go over the amendments to the Washington State Energy Code. And then DMC Title 10 updates will provide the amendments at a future meeting. And then we'll close with a summary and questions. Sorry, excuse me, I'm fighting a little bit of a cold. For the introduction, the international codes are updated every 3 years. Each version must be formally adopted by the city. Duval adopts the Washington State Code, which has amendments to the international codes approved by the Washington State Building Code Council. So any of the amendments that we are adding to our DMC Title 10 has to be submitted and approved by the SBCC board. The following presentation will highlight the significant changes from the current code that we are under, 2018, to the 2021 codes. For the building code 2021, definitions, puzzle room, this type of amusement area in which occupants are encouraged to solve and challenge to escape from a room or series of rooms. There actually has not been anything within the code that would address anything to do with a puzzle room. So it's nice to have this for emergency exits, occupant loads, the use type of classification. So we are catching up with new ideas. I know puzzle room has been around for a little while, and now the code is just now catching up to it and acknowledging it. The International Building Code for smoke control and atriums. In the evaluation of whether a smoke control system is required for an atrium condition, vertical opening protection consisting of a combination of both the atrium and the shaft enclosure is now recognized. Before, we didn't have the definitions or the protection for an atrium, or to what extent an atrium shall be protected. Now it aligns with the shaft enclosure, which typically gives us a 2-hour rated assembly. So that's a good one that we needed clarification on. The next building code amendment is the activation of automatic closing doors in group I2. I2s are typically medical facilities, inpatient treatment facilities. So for this, the closing of automatic closing doors on hold open devices must now also occur upon activation of the fire alarm system or automatic sprinkler system. So that is intertwined now. Again, puzzle rooms, here's some Exidine. 4 puzzle rooms are now regulated in manner consistent with the traditional special amusement areas. Special means of egress requirements have been established for puzzle rooms. Just an example of the photo there for Exidine. Another amendment or revision to the building code. Firewalls used for control areas. The scoping of limitations of a firewall's use to create separate buildings have been expanded through a new allowance for the number of control areas permitted. Play structures. The interior finish materials of play structures are now regulated for flame spread purposes. Play structures shall not be greater than 600 square feet in area unless a special investigation acceptable to the building official has demonstrated adequate fire safety. So this would be for indoor, climbing, as the photo shows, climbing rocks, and also play structures for children. The next one for the building code would be the allowable area frontage increase. The methodology for establishing the permissible allowance area increase for frontage has been simplified by using a table. So the table has been inserted. Previously, it was a formula, which was very complex. So now they simplified it by adding the table to figure out the frontage increase of the building location. Now we're going into the changes or updates for the International Residential Code. For our area, the wind design has been aligned in the IRC now with 110, with the IBC and ASCE, the 7 mapping system. Opening protection, this is also in the IRC. It has been clarified to state that doors separating the garage and dwellings must be self-latching. That was not in there, as well as self-closing. The only thing that was required was the rating, 20-minute rating door between the garage and habitable space, and then the sealant of the doors, and then now with the self-latching, it's well defined for that. In the residential code, operational constraints and opening control devices. This will clarify that window openings, control devices, and fall prevention devices comply with this requirement of ASTM 2090 and shall be allowed on emergency escape and rescue of windows. The height of the mechanism is restricted to not more than 70 inches above the finished floor. Another one for the International Residential Code, stairways. This clarifies that stairways not within or attached to a building, porch, or deck are not regulated by this section. For an example, a stairway in the yard leading to a fire pit area would not have to meet the riser height, tread depth, handrail, etc. The requirements that a stairway inside of a house must meet. The only requirement would be to the main egress door, which in a residential R3 would be the front door. So anywhere where there's 4 or more risers, a handrail would be required as long as a guardrail within 30 inches of grade within 3 feet of that dedicated pathway. The International Residential Code, this has to do with smoke alarms and locations. It's modified with a new location requirement for smoke alarms to address areas with high ceilings adjacent to hallways. So this has to do with the location of them. in the hallway and in the room open to the hallway, where the ceiling height of a room open to a hallway serving bedrooms exceeds that of the hallway by 24 inches or more. So typically with that, say in a bedroom and a doorway going through, there might be some girder trusses that are lower. And so now there's this requirement that if it's greater than 24 inches, then the location would have to be per this diagram. So there was nothing helping us out in the IRC previously. So this will be helpful. International Residential Code, another one. Alteration, repairs, and additions is modified to require that carbon monoxide alarms shall be installed when there are repairs to or replacement of fuel-fired mechanical systems. For the residential code, habitable attics is modified to limit the area of a habitable attic to not greater than 1/3 of the floor area of the story below. The allowable area is allowed to be increased to not greater than 1/2 of the floor area of the story below when located within a dwelling unit equipped with a fire sprinkler system. This is very helpful because previously within the habitable attic section of the IRC, there were no real requirements and limitations of that. They're treating this more along the lines of the IBC for a mezzanine. So it's nice to have some correlation with the IBC and the IRC in this next code cycle. For the residential code, this is a new one, garage door labeling. So we'll have to be inspecting this at our finals for occupancies. Labeling is required that all garage doors have a permanent label provided at by the manufacturer. The label shall identify the door manufacturer, the model, serial number, and the wind pressure is the big one, rating, the installation, instruction, drawing, reference number, and all applicable tests. For the residential code, this is the certificate that you typically will see by the electrical panel in your home. This will be modified by requiring additional information related to the building thermal envelope. The new one would be solar energy and energy rating index, and the code edition be added to the energy certificate. And this will be placed at or near the panels. This is for the fire code. This is a real big one. The group F1 distilled spirits. So this is making of the alcohol liquor. An automatic sprinkler system shall be provided throughout a group F1 fire area used for the manufacture of distilled spirits. Previously, this was an automatic fire sprinkler system was required based off of square footage. That has been removed, and now all uses of F1 are required to have a sprinkler system. So it does not matter the size of the building or use that it is. For group R1s, a fire alarm system and smoke alarms shall be installed in existing group R1s. This is hotels, motels, in accordance with section 1103.7.5.1 and through 0.2.1. Group R1, hotel and motel, manual fire alarm systems. Manual fire alarm systems that activates the occupant notification system in accordance with the section 9075 shall be installed in existing group R1 hotels and motels more than 1 story in height or more than 20 sleeping units. The 20 sleeping units is new, and then also with the 1 story in height. The International Wildland Urban Interface Code. This is a new code that was adopted by the state. It actually was adopted in 2021 and was not required to be enforced or adopted until the DNR map was complete. The DNR map is from the Department of National Resources, and it delineates your property into one of 5 interfaces, and we'll go over that shortly. But this is a big new code that a lot of jurisdictions have had a little bit of a difficult time understanding. So we'll go through this and hopefully explain it to you as best as we possibly can. This is like I said, one of the biggest changes in the code cycle is the WUI, they called it, which adds the fire protection standards based on your proximity to the wildlands and other areas with vegetated fuels that also can contribute to wildfires. The city is partnering with local jurisdictions in our region to bring awareness to our building community and hopefully providing clarity on some prescriptive options to make this transition easier to understand. We'll be handing out flyers. The city of Duval, I'm working closely with other building officials in the area, and we'll be providing flyers out to the public and to developers just to be aware of what will be required and how they can meet the code. The current DNR map, and to your left, that's the map of the state. It includes interfaces. There is the urban areas, the wildland urban interface, the wildland urban intermix, and the wildlands and long-term non-buildable areas. This DNR map update is to be done every 3 years, and it's to align with the code cycle updates. We, the local municipalities, are required to update this map. And how we would do that is providing the findings of facts. Findings of facts are forms from the DNR that the applicant will be filling out for a new development, and that is to change the mapping or where they're at within the map to a different color or use within that area. And I'll go through that a little bit further. So the urban areas, pretty self-explanatory. Those are the gray areas. They're those areas in Washington with both dense human development, as well as less than 50% vegetated wildland coverage. These areas are defined by their high density of structure. And you'll find that how Seattle is majority of that in the larger cities. And you can see Duval does not fall under that area. The wildland urban interface. The interface is also often found along the outskirts of urban areas. The wildland urban interface is defined as those areas where the human development meets areas that are covered with more than 50% wildlands. To be considered interface, development structures must be bordered by wildlands on at least one side. And as you can see, Duval is majority of this. The wildland urban intermix are those areas where structures intermingle with the wildlands. To be considered intermix, a development or structure must be surrounded on 2 or more sides by wildlands. The intermix is often found between the interface and the wildlands. Intermix can be also found in undeveloped low density pockets of urban areas. So I wanted to point out on the map on the left how it's really squared and how the DNR mapping system provided this layout is in blocks of acres. So each 20 acres square is how they came up with this layout. So that's why it's pretty rigid and not well laid out. The wildlands are those areas in the green are without any structures or human development that also can have more than 50% burnable vegetated cover. Most wildlands could eventually become intermix, interface, or even urban areas. An example, a new single family home in the woods could make woodlands into intermix, while a new housing development or strip mall or other series of structures could turn a section of wildlands into interface. So to have a new development come in and change the wildlands from a green to say the red, they would provide the finding of facts form from the DNR to the city when they come in for a development. And then we would walk through the process of the review based off of the code that is provided that has tables that will guide them and direct them to what they would fall under based off of the density. So to be compliant we have found that the prescriptive options, as outlined in this section, the 501.1 through 501.8, gives you the way, probably one of the easier ways, I should say, to comply with the wildland interurban code. So the main prescriptive options, so say in a re-roof, a Class A roofing material and metal roof valleys will be required. And that would apply for a re-roof and all new buildings that fall within the red or the yellow, which Duval does. The red and the yellow intermingle with each other, and the requirements are the same, even though they are different color. The requirements would be the same prescriptively. For the exterior walls and projections, they must be made of ignition resistant materials. And so what that would be is a brand would be the Hardy board. That would fall under that, which is typical in a lot of the homes. What would need to be different, most likely it would be the trim packages that are provided would need to be ignition resistant materials. The double paned or tempered windows, that's already a requirement for the energy code. So that would be nothing new. The other big one would be the rated decks or concrete patios. The rated decks would most likely be either the 1 hour rated or the heavy timber. And there's a table within the code to provide compliance on that part. And then there's also some specific requirements of the deck, no storage underneath and whatnot. And then also there's specific attic ventilation opening requirements where it would be solid blocking on the bird blocks and then a specific venting in the roof. And that's how they would that is how prescriptively you would be able to comply with the new WUI code. For the 2021 Washington State Energy Code, Washington's first energy code was adopted back in 1977 by statute. It was a volunteer requirement. The State Building Code Act and State Energy Code Act were passed by legislator in 1985. The State Building Code Act gave rulemaking authority to the SBCC, which is the State Building Code Council, which oversees all building and energy codes within the state. And now we're going to fast forward to 2013, where Governor Inslee brought together a bipartisan group of lawmakers, which developed a plan for the state to meet its greenhouse gas emissions target. And the table is just showing you on the left when it started back in 2006 and to where we are at and where we're projected by 2030 and will need to comply based off of the requirements of the state. One of the significant changes for the Washington Energy Code would be the R values in insulation. They have been increased. The ceiling increase went from a R49 requirement to an R60. And then for wood frame, so this would be any vertical walls, will increase from an R21 or an R13. So an R21 would be in a 2x6, R13 would be in a 2x4 cavity, to a 20+5 or a 13+10. The 20+5 would be, the 5 would be continuous insulation on the exterior, and that is a new requirement. So it is required to have continuous insulation. And there were some questions or concerns about how you can continuously insulate the building, but also keeping the shear factor. And so that has been resolved. And then the 13 and 10 is the 2x4 cavities, which is the same setup. The other major change would be the slab depth increase from 2 to 4. For a slab on grade, currently is 2 feet with a rigid R10 insulation, and now it's going to the 4 feet of requirement for rigid insulation. How to achieve the ceiling increase from the R49 to the R60, they will be most likely in the roofs will be required to have heel trusses, which in essence raises the trusses higher. You'll see a larger roof assembly in order for you to be able to achieve the R60 requirement. Here are some examples of the R60. I just wanted to show you how there's different options to achieve this, along with the 20+5 with the R60 installation. And I already went over the +5 refers to the continuous rigid insulation on the outside. The other major change within the Washington State Energy Code are the credits. So to the left is part of R 406.3 in the code, which is the requirements that you have to meet for the energy code based off of the size of the dwelling units that you are to build. So the total energy credits have been reduced in dwelling units by 1 credit, and I'll go a little bit further into that on the next slide. Additions under 150 square feet don't require energy credits. This is new compared to last year, where they were required to comply. Additions 150 square feet to 150 are required to have 2 credits. And how you achieve these credits are based off of the table that they have provided on how you can meet these credit requirements. And I believe here is one example of the table to your left. The big one is the fuel for heating the buildings for R3, so residential units. One of the main changes I'm sure many are aware of, the gas furnace has a primary heat source. This currently is allowed, but now with this new code, you will be docked -3 credits as that for a gas furnace as the primary heat source. As you know, it's number 1 on the table to your left. The electric heat pumps with supplemental heating from a furnace will now be 0 credits. So what they want is a heat. How to achieve it would be a heat pump as your primary, and then typically there's a lockout on the gas furnace to kick in, typically at 35 degrees. That's when the gas furnace will be the main. And then in summary, building codes are evolving and for good reasons. It is important that we adopt the latest edition to stay current with state requirements and to stay in line with other cities in our area to better protect our city and the people that live here. The 2021 international codes in the Washington State Building Code will be in effect July 1st of this year. And then for the next meeting, we'll be providing the Title 10 amendments for you for us to go over and for you to review. And that concludes the presentation. And opening up for any questions.
Any questions? And just a quick check, clerk, we didn't have anyone else join, any other council members in the audience, or? I don't think we probably did, I just wanted to confirm. Sure. Any questions from council members here? Councilmember Knapp?
Yeah, I just wanted to double check. Everything we're adopting here, we're adopting as is. We didn't do any default specific changes. So basically we're just accepting what it is.
For the amendments for the 2021, we are pretty much adopting as is from the state building code. What we're going to be doing in the Title 10 updates as of last code cycle was more of a formatting, and this code cycle will be some adoption and changes to the fire code in section 10.04. We're going to be moving that over into 10.01, and then some addressing, but minor in nature. Anything that we are looking at amending within that, we would have to submit to the SBCC, and they'd have to approve that through these codes, and then we're able to amend that part of it. But currently, we're going to be adopting, what I'm providing is adopting as is.
Okay,
Other questions? Did you have another? Sorry.
I do, I'm so
Okay.
sorry, but yeah, I mean, good to ask everyone else first, but, I guess I see now why there's a big rush to get permits through, because this looks like it will be very expensive for builders and even for residents, if they're doing remodels, additions, I don't know, this, it sounds like since we're just adopting it as is there any kind of interactive question answer for the community if they're saying, hey, I need a new roof? What's changing? You know, things like that. Is there something that we could let the community know? Because I think the builders, it sounds like there's outreach to the builders, but for the average homeowner where, you know, they go out to get their furnace replaced and now they have to install a carbon monoxide detector, it sounds like. I mean, it just sounds like there might be some things that our community would be curious about, and it's not just Duval, it's everyone who is implementing these things. And I don't know if there's a resource we could let the community know.
Yeah, most definitely. So what we are joining forces with are other cities. So Monroe is one of them. And we're creating a flyer that we're actually going to be able to provide to the public. Just an information of, hey, this is what it is. This is coming down, some of the requirements that are needed. And then also we will be putting this on our website for public outreach as well.
Okay,
Brian, do you have the one flyer that's already ready that you could just throw up on the screen?
I had it in the other presentation from 5.2, but it looks like it's no longer on this PowerPoint, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. We'll,
Yeah, I can definitely provide it. Yes, I'll bring it next time too as well.
okay, thank you.
Councilmember Mercer?
Yeah, and Brian, just actually sort of one follow-up, it's a little bit in the same line, and I did not dig into the codes, because I know very often there's a threshold in which these things kick in terms of, you know, from a remodeling, it's a percentage of the structure, or it applies to the new addition versus the old. I think that's where a lot of the concerns come in. Obviously, the carbon monoxide detector is sort of an incremental cost. Yeah, if you had a storm and your roof structure torn off, that could put you in a case where you then would need to conform to that. Obviously, the insulation standards will hit new construction, so that's both the material costs and labor costs. But I think that's where a lot of the questions will come in. I think obviously there's a net benefit to the environment and the community, but there's also, yeah, particularly we're already in a high cost construction market, to sort of layer that on top. I think the clarification also that any changes that we would need to go back and get adopted at a certain state level, so it's not as simple as Duval taking a one-off change without a lot of review. So that's where the community education will kick in. But I did want to just clarify that, Laura, in terms of there's still that same applicability in when these things would kick in. No real changes in terms of when you have to conform to the new guidelines.
Yeah, honestly, it's really nice that we're working with some of our adjacent cities to come through with these fact sheets, and that we're kind of helping align, you know, jurisdictionally across our boundary and more regionally too, because then I think it'll be more helpful to the builders and to our homeowners, and then hopefully to all the contractors as well. And, you know, we'll be hosting probably some, you know, drop-in meetings, which is kind of historically what we do when we're going through a transition. And I was thinking, Brian, maybe we should communicate with some of the more common contractors as well. But at least from me hearing about this already, the majority of them are already definitely knowledgeable about what's going on. I think there was some hope that we might get a little bit of a breather and maybe adopt it not in July, but, you know, later on in the year or next year. But the legislature and the code council did not move in that direction.
Anything other, Councilmember Macklin?
but if anyone else. I just had a question, it was talking about siding and in the area we're at, would it no longer be allowed to have cedar siding? Or what about, I mean, my roof and many others are cedar roofs. Are those materials no longer allowed, or?
That is correct, based off of the WUI code. Yeah, and when I did sit through a bunch of the training for this code, which was put on by the city of Seattle, the requirement would be is, you have to enforce it, and this is the code. So there really wasn't any way that we could get around that. And we do fall within that mapping system, and we are required to enforce that part of it. So yes, it would be non-combustible based off of the DNR map for the city, falls within the red and the yellow, and that would prescriptively be non-combustible materials.
So basically no natural materials, it has to be like manufactured, fire safe siding.
Yeah, it'd have to be either rated, yes, or non-combustible.
So that's another area, Laura, sorry, just to add on to this comment is, that's another area that there might be an opportunity for outreach. I know a lot of the HOAs within their bylaws have requirements to replace siding with cedar, and they may need to amend that if from an architectural.
We will definitely plan on doing reach out. We actually have our communications person starting
Monday.
Monday.
I
I was like, I'm so lost on the dates these days. And so we'll be working with them as well. And we do have, for the most part, pretty good email for our HOAs. So we're gonna be sending out that. I mean, I'm pretty sure all of us can relate to HOAs, like my Joe have to be doing some changes as well, because we have, these requirements coming up.
That's actually my question that popped into my head when you started talking about roofs. I'm like, wow, they're gonna have to rewrite some things probably, because you wouldn't want those to be in conflict, obviously, when people are replacing the roofs, so.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, Brian, thank you very much. And look forward to hearing a little bit more about that in the future.
Thank you.
In June with actual ordinance, and we'll hit it twice.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Renee.
Next up, we have our investment policy with Director Mason.
Good evening, Council. Dana Mason, Finance Director. Go ahead and share my screen. Everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So the investment policy is just one that's been needed to be updated for a while. So the agenda today, why update it? We'll talk a little bit about our current investments as of the end of April, the current investment strategy, an overview of the changes to the policy, and then an opportunity for any questions or discussion. So why update? The policy was last updated in 2011. Some of the investments in our policy are no longer allowed, and then the state has allowed more investments for local governments, the RCWs, to change to expand the offering of investments. And then some clarification was just needed for the length of some maturities in our policy. So the current investments as of April 30th, I'm just going to move. I can't really see there we go. All right, so the city, this is in order of liquidity. So we have a public fund savings account that's attached to our checking account. And the April interest rate is 3.2%. There's just about $1 million, just over $1 million in it as of the end of the April. And the reason why we have this account, it's just a really easy way for us to transfer money from out of our checking account and get interest, even if we know that we're going to need it maybe a few days later or the next week. It's just a really liquid, easy way for us to get money. And we keep our checking account around $1.2 million. The local government local government investment pool is almost 60% of the portfolio. The April interest rate was 4.9%. In comparison, last April, the interest rate was 0.4%. So it has grown significantly. All the local government investment pool investments are very short term. It's usually less than a year. So the interest rates are really, really high right now. The cities, and this is also very liquid pool for the city. So the city can take money out of this investment pool within a day's notice. So it's not quite as easy as our savings account, public fund savings account, but it's pretty easy. And then the treasuries and securities, this is our bond, the city's bond portfolio. The yield to maturity, so the yield right now is 2.33%. And like a year ago, this would have been amazing. But this portfolio is just to mitigate the risk when the local government investment pool, or LGIP, when this interest rate, the interest rate goes down, the treasuries and bonds will kind of make up for the difference in the interest. So we're just mitigating risk with this account. And the average maturity right now is 1.78 years, and the city has $15 million in the account. And all of the interest from these three different accounts, it's allocated monthly to each fund, and it's based on fund balance or cash balance. So the city's current investment strategy is we put most of our money in the LGIP, but we also have recently, since 2021, grown the bond investments to $15 million in non-callable bonds. The goal is an average maturity of 2 to 2.5 years, and we're getting there with a bond maturing each quarter. And then those bonds that mature are reinvested unless they're needed for capital purposes. So far, every bond that's matured has just been reinvested. Significant changes to policy. So we use the updated template from the Washington Public Treasurers Association, which has some investment additions. So supranationals, those are the World Bank or large European Union, large governments or governmental entities that the city could now invest in if they wanted to. Corporate notes, which are just corporate bonds that have to have a specific rating, a specific high rating. Bonds from the state of Washington and other local governments, bonds of any other state and local governments. And then there's kind of a disclosure or an addition, any investments allowed by law. Allowable investment deletions, banker acceptances, and we went over this policy with the city uses time value investments as an investment advisor company. And we went over the policy with them. And the reason we took out banker acceptances is because they're just not used. So, and then money market mutual funds are no longer allowed by law. So that needed to come out of the policy. And then also diversification percentages were expanded and just shown in a table for clarification. So for example, the city could, under this policy, put all of its money into the local government investment pool, put all of its investments into US Treasury obligations, 90% into federal securities, 40% into public fund interest bearing accounts. And this table comes directly from the Washington Public Treasurers Association, and it's just suggested percentages. And then we also changed the investment maturity to set at a maximum of 5 years, except when compatible with a specific fund's needs. So if the city did have a fund that wasn't going to be using the money, maybe that we were setting it aside for the next 10 years, it would be allowable to maybe buy some bonds further out than the 3 to 5 range or 3 to 5 year range. And then the policy also requires an appropriate benchmark be established as a measurement of performance. The recommended benchmark is the 2-year treasury yield. As of April 28th, the 2-year treasury was at 4.14 and the city portfolio was at 3.38. And I think as some of our older bonds mature, we'll be able to get this rate up higher, closer to the 2-year. And that is it. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions for Director Mason? Councilmember Sutton?
Yeah, you mentioned the interest that accrues off our investments. Where does that go?
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, the investments that you mentioned at the beginning. The public funds, the local government, US Treasury. You mentioned something about the interest.
Oh,
Where's
Yes.
that? Where's that go?
so what the interest is allocated to each fund, I should turn on my camera so you can. The interest is allocated to each fund based on the fund's cash balance that month. So when we get all of our interest this month, or for April, it's about $100,000 in interest, which is amazing. And then we see what the cash balance is for each fund: general fund, utility funds, REIT, the strategic fund, and then we just allocate it based on the percentage of cash.
Okay, so it goes back into these general funds or
Yep,
whatever.
it just goes right back into the different funds, yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Councilmember Nelson?
Yeah, so this had come up in the finance committee, and I went back and there was an email that kind of summarized some ideas from way back when. And so I went back and looked at kind of what were the topics that we were talking about. And one of them was the WPTA certification, and I don't know how many changes we made from their template, but are we planning on having them review it before? Because I think I read that they would prefer it be reviewed before it's brought to a council
Yes.
for approval. So I don't know if this is just kind of a first touch and then we have them review
This is
it.
definitely a first touch, and then, yes, it would go to the WPTA for review.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, go ahead.
And then there was something that we had kind of talked about before that some policies have, and it had been a recommendation of WPTA that you have, I think, competitive transactions. So you try to get 3 bids on purchases of securities. But I don't think we've been doing that. And I don't know if that's something that WPTA still recommends or.
I will look into that right
Okay.
now. Because right now we just use our investment advisor, and he gives us several options of different bonds or investments to make, and then we discuss it. But I will look into that.
Okay, and then some of the other policies that we looked at had minimum ratings on purchases. So, you might need an AA- or, just requiring certain ratings, obviously, you know what that means.
Yeah,
And so I don't know if that was something that, I guess I'm just trying to figure out. I know we use the WPTA template, but like how much did we modify from that? Because some other policies I've seen have things like, before a purchase or something, it needs 2 people to sign off on it, or I don't know, there's just other things that I've seen in other policies, and I wasn't sure if we modified it because we're a smaller city and didn't quite have that many layers of oversight.
yeah. So it was modified slightly. To your question about the ratings, there is something in there for corporate notes that we have to follow the ratings. I believe it's I'm trying to bring up the policy real quickly here. Authorized investments. So for corporate notes, the ratings, the policy adheres to the investment policies and procedures adopted by the Washington State Investment Board. And so that does have the ratings for corporate notes.
Okay, so we refer to another policy that then requires us to do that.
Yes, yes. So this would,
Okay.
yeah, but this will go to, I should say, go to the WPTA for an additional review once we've made all of our changes.
Administrator, yeah.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the process, because it'll follow the process of other policies we bring to council. So a first touch, you can all see the draft. If you want to make requests for edits or modifications, I'll collect those. We'll mark up the draft, we'll go through, vote by consent, which of the edits and suggestions you're interested in as a council. I'll make a final draft, we'll get it off for certification, so we'll kind of follow a process very similar to how we did with the council procedures. So this is just an introduction to the revision. Director Mason very kindly and graciously gave us a review because it is a very expired policy since 2011. And so her swan song is to get us prepared to have a current version that we can work from. Councilmember Mercer?
Just sort of a follow-up question, because Jennifer triggered a couple thoughts, but beyond the bond rating and the requirements or guidance that's presented in terms of allowable funds, allowable investment types, you indicated there's sort of that broad category of other allowed investments. Do our existing city policies have any constraints or guidance around sort of fee structure in terms of from an investment beyond the types of investments, but focusing on low fee investments or from a fiduciary relationship that would prevent sort of those secondary costs cutting into the investment returns? I was just curious.
So I think if I understand your question, you're wondering, so our policy, the objectives are safety, liquidity, and return on investment. And that's kind of the order of it. And we tend to be, and all cities tend to be pretty risk adverse. We stick to treasuries, which are sure things, federal securities, so the federal agencies. So those are things like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Nothing else has come to my mind, but they are actually now listed in this policy. So it's unlikely that, I do know of cities that are going with corporate notes, because you do get a better return on investment, and they do have to have really high ratings. So it just depends on, now that this has been broadened, it depends on what the city's investment advisor brings to us and says, hey, this is what you could do, with this maturing $1 million. And then we would discuss it and see if we wanted to go forth. But most of these investments are very safe, and I would say all of them are pretty safe and low risk. Did that answer your question? It's hard for me to kind of hear with the echo in the room, so I apologize.
No, and I think I'm more familiar with sort of personal investments where you're looking to minimize commissions, you're looking to minimize transactions in and out costs, conversion costs. I know for some of the bonds and various things, those are not a case, but some of the other funds that could be invested in, potentially could incur some costs. And my assumption was, as part of the prioritizing return, you would also look at minimizing costs that would reduce or cut into that return. So I guess I was just asking explicitly if that's a policy or if that's primarily just avoided and taken care of based on the investments that the city traditionally makes that would naturally keep those costs down.
Yeah, so we do have an agreement with TVI. I believe it's 7 basis points that they charge us. It's a pretty low amount for the investments. So they don't make a lot of money on our city. There are cities that have investment, it may be less than 7 basis points. I'll look it up and figure it out for you. But there are cities that do have a non-discretionary investment advisors, and they pay them a flat amount every year to run the investment program and make recommendations. So that could be a direction that the city goes. But we would probably have to have a larger portfolio to make it worth their time. But it's definitely something the city could look into.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Councilmember Nafna?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Councilmember Mercer, and I think we've talked about it before, like, are we an assets under management type fee structure? Does each purchase have an embedded number of basis points that they get a commission? And I think that was where I was trying to get at, you know, do we have competitive bids? Are we looking at, you know, and so I don't know if that is, it sounds like we just have a flat 7 basis points on
We
each.
do. I'm gonna look that up just to make sure. I know it's in a report somewhere, so.
Okay, because I'd be really curious about that and just, you know, comparing, is that competitive? Because as we're increasing our volume, we have a lot more dollars recently.
Right.
So the volume we're doing is higher, that we could negotiate something lower. I don't know what a competitive rate is, so. I don't know, kind of what you were curious about too.
Yeah, and it may, again, just trying to ask a question,
Yeah.
because I don't know, this is, so,
Okay.
but appreciate it.
Any other questions before we move on to our next one? All right, let's move on to reserve fund balance policies, again with Director Mason.
All righty, let me just bring that up real quickly. I'm almost there. Let's see. And share. Okay, so the good evening again. The reserve fund policy is another policy that has not been updated for quite some time. So for the agenda, we'll just talk about the key components of a reserve policy, just an overview of fund balance definition, the types of fund balance and reserves, an update overview, and then the table of recommended policy updates, and then of course a discussion. So the key components of reserve policy is scope and purpose. For this policy, you designate applicability. This policy applies to major operating funds, their interdependent funds, and the utility CIP funds, and it kind of removes the internal service funds reserve requirements out of the policy. And then it's an effective policy in place to minimize financial crisis and provide stability. A reserve policy should identify the appropriate reserve level, and so ours is to meet cash flow needs. And then also, while doing that, consider the impacts of debt and other external restrictions. And then the use and replenishment of funds is important to the policy. When can the reserves be used? And it's to mitigate, some of the reserves are just to mitigate short-term effects of revenue shortages, cash flow shortages, and others are for emergencies and unforeseen expenditures. And then the policy should describe how the reserves and fund balance will be replenished if used. And in this policy, and needs to be established during the budget process. Fund balance definition. Fund balance is simply net cash after revenues have been deposited and expenditures have been paid. And the terms reserve and fund balance are often used interchangeably. The types of fund balance, non-spendable. The city doesn't have any of this. It would be if someone possibly made a donation to the city and said that the money had to be held in perpetuity, but the insurance could be, the interest could be spent. So that money held in perpetuity, it would be non-spendable. Restricted is just, it's fund balance that's restricted by external constraints. So debt, grant revenue is restricted for specific purposes, or laws of other governments. For example, RCWs, like our real estate excess tax, can only be spent for specific capital improvement purchases. Committed balance that's internal constraints imposed by formal action of the city's highest level decision making. So an example here would be the Big Rock ball fields. The city has to put away 50% of that money to save for future field replacement. And that's by resolution. And then the assigned and unassigned, that's kind of what we're talking about in this policy. Assigned, it's just constrained by the city's intent fees for a specific purpose. So all of the money that's sitting in the street fund, council intends that to be used on streets. So that's assigned. It's the only unassigned fund balance is the general fund. So I hope that all makes sense. So here's just an update of the update overview. So the last reserve balance policy was adopted in 2024. And this update adds reserves for funds that are or can be interdependent on the general fund, like the street fund and the Big Rock fund, and maybe in the future, the building and permitting fund. Because if they don't generate enough revenue, the general fund transfers money into those funds to help pay for operations. It updates the policy on the contingency fund. It simplifies reserves for operating utility funds. And then it adds reserve for the utility CIP funds based on the studies that were done in the past few years. And then it also clarifies the balance requirements for the internal service funds. And then here's just a little table of the differences. So the general fund, the current policy is 17%, and the recommended policy is very close. It's just 2 months, and that's best practice. And then that goes down to the street fund, interdependent funds, the Big Rock Ballpark Fund, and the building and permitting fund. We did this as part of the budgeting process. We said there should be 2 months of operating reserves, but now it's actually in policy. The contingency fund is still the max allowed by RCW, but there is a clause in this policy that says the transfer won't be made until the end of the biennium. When the reserves of the general fund have been made, then the city can transfer money over to the contingency fund to the max allowed by law. The water operating fund, these were numbers plus CPI, so it was just growing and growing and growing every year. So now it's just 2 months, which is a best practice for each, the water, sewer, and operating fund. And then the water CIP fund, this was based on the water study, so it was 500,000 they thought should be in reserves for unforeseen emergencies. And then we added the engineering news record as an inflationary or an inflator for every year. The sewer CIP fund, the study said 2% of the initial implant assets. Director Leniszewski calculated that to be 300,000, and then we added ENR. And then for the storm drainage CIP fund, we just followed the water CIP fund. And then internal service funds, the old policy had for the equipment replacement fund just not to exceed, or I don't think it was not to exceed, excuse me. I think it couldn't be under 200,000. And so we're now just looking to the internal service fund allocation policy, which allocates enough money for future replacements. So it's not just based on an arbitrary number, but building that fund so we can replace our vehicles when they're ready to be replaced. And then that also transfers over to the IT fund. There should always be enough money in there to replace, the software that we just purchased, that implementation portion of OpenGov, and of course servers and laptops and their IT needs. And then there's just some clarifying language as far as use of reserves. It's per policy and budget. The replenishment of reserves will be planned during budget if there is a use of some of the emergency reserves. And then the reserves will be reported to council quarterly, which is current. And that's it. Are there any questions?
Questions? Councilmember Nelson?
Yeah. I saw you jotting some things down there.
That was-
Maybe have some questions.
You do have them. Well, we've talked about these things in finance committee a lot over the years, and wanted to do this policy, so, anyway, there's been discussion prior. So just out of curiosity, let me see, I'm trying to think of, I've written notes all over, I'm trying to think of what word to ask. Okay, so on the utility reserves, I remember thinking that those seemed really low. If that came from the, like the water comp plan and the sewer comp plan. The sewer one especially has so much equipment that if something went wrong, $300,000 really wouldn't replace much. And so that number especially seems incredibly low, considering that asset is probably our most expensive. Anyway, that just seems surprisingly low to only hold 100,000.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. We went with what the recommendation was for the study, which was the original cost of the implant asset at 2% of it. So I would be more comfortable with it being 500,000 like the water and the storm drainage, but that was the recommendation of the policy.
Yeah, I mean, I just, compared to what we've been doing, it just seems really low. And then the question would be, at what point do you start applying the ENR? Because if it was 2% of the original cost, well, we originally paid for it when things were much less expensive. So are you applying ENR for 20 years? Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess I'm just trying to figure out, that doesn't seem like a present value.
Right. The study did not, it just said the original cost of, or 2% of the original implant asset. So that's what we were going with, that recommendation. And really, this is just for emergencies. So it's not to actually replace something. We're saving other money for that. This is just to always have this just in case something breaks and we have to fix it. And it wasn't in our CIP plan or something like that.
Councilmember Mercer, is that all of your question?
Okay.
Do you still have more?
I have a few more. Okay.
Sorry, I just want to make sure we take care and check in with others so that everyone gets a turn.
Usually these things are discussed in committee and there's a lot of time to, so I do have questions. Okay. So on the internal service fund and the IT and some of those others, it doesn't seem like there's anything really specified. And so we basically pay as you go, it seems almost. It makes me feel a little nervous that there wouldn't be an expectation of a dollar amount. I guess that's what I'm confused about. Because things don't always end up on a perfect rotation. You might have to build a balance depending on a replacement schedule. And so maybe you could help me understand.
Sure, you got it. So what the policy says, it says it must be sufficient to cover internal service operations as well as provide for future equipment replacement expenditures. So we have an allocation policy which shows how we basically, when we buy a vehicle, we start paying into the internal service fund or the equipment replacement fund to buy that future vehicle. So we are building that up right now. The city's still a little bit behind because we just started this program or this allocation policy a few years ago, but we're getting closer. So it's we doubled it. We were doing 5% additional a year to build it up, and this biennium we're doing 10% additional per year. But this is basically just saying there's not a set amount that should be in there. There should be enough to replace the equipment when it's due to be replaced.
I guess that I guess if there was a failure of something and you weren't having any kind of balance or reserve. Or for example, when I've watched that replacement fund and the schedule, often the amount we're saving up doesn't seem to take into account that prices go up necessarily. So we might be putting money in thinking it's gonna cost this much, but then we buy a different truck or a more expensive truck. Or now, you know what I mean? And so I do worry a little bit that we aren't going to have enough for our building repairs and all of that. It seems strange to not at least a
Yeah.
balance.
So the building, the building repair fund is a little separate because we've been waiting to determine the types of allocations until we get back the facilities plan that's being done. But for the equipment replacement fund, that balance is also getting interest. So it's, you know, we put in a future value. So we don't say, okay, the truck was purchased for 30,000. We cost it out at a future value. So it is higher. And then on top of that, interest goes in there and any surplus. So if a vehicle is sold, the surplus amount goes back to the equipment replacement fund if that vehicle was purchased out of that fund. So there's a lot of little extra bits of money they get in there. And then what we're doing is what we did last biennium and this biennium for the budget is we looked at the balance and said, okay, how are we doing as far as the amounts that we need for future replacements? So that can be adjusted based on each biennium based on costs and also whether, you know, there's additional surplus in there. Maybe one year we'll be like, we're full up. We don't need any more money in this fund. We can buy everything. So it is adjusted every single year,
Okay.
or it should be. It has been for the past 2 bienniums.
And then I also wanted to double check that this reserve is a number we don't go below. It's not used for cash flow maintenance or cash flow, I'm using the wrong word. But do you know what I mean? Like.
So are you talking about the operating reserves or the internal stuff? So operating, yeah. So the operating reserve is really for the operating funds. We don't really have a problem with it here at the city of Duval, at least at that point, because we bill our utilities on a monthly basis. So we constantly have cash coming in, which is really nice. And then the general fund generates, you know, our property tax comes, there's times when it gets a little bit low, but right now our fund balance is high enough that we can wait out. We're getting consistent amount of sales tax. And then if it gets a little low, we get a big chunk of property tax. But really what that is, the operating reserves is really just a short-term bridge. That's the goal, to have it in there, that short-term bridge. But one month it might be a little bit low, and then it comes back as soon as you're replenished with, you know, for example, property tax. When you get that big chunk in April, it's replenished. But it should, I mean, the goal is to have it pretty steady throughout the whole year. But the operating reserve is really just to mitigate those downs whenever there's a little revenue that doesn't come in as consistently or yeah, just not consistent. But this city really doesn't have a problem with that.
But technically, the way it's written is on a day-to-day, you're allowed to go below the reserve.
Yeah, but you should have it at the beginning of your budget, and you should budget for that amount of reserve.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, thanks.
Anything else? Oh, Administrator, and we'll use the same process for this, which is, you know, have the draft policy, accept comments, feedback, send them to me. I'll note them, create a draft for council to consider and vote by consent on different elements of the revisions and edits and comments.
And it gives everyone time to mull it over a little bit more. especially after this
Yeah,
session.
again, these are just first touches. I would add today particularly, we're really trying to focus on cleaning up some of these old policies and bringing them forward. Just because it's the responsible thing to do. But also some of these policies are so out of date that they're not compliant, and we really want to make sure that we have compliant policies.
Well, thank you, Director Mason. Have a good night. Oh, unless she's staying on too, but, next up, we have our purchasing policy manual with our Administrator McDonough.
Thank you. And, first, Carol, I'm bringing it up. So this kind of in the same vein, it is very much a first touch to all council, recognizing that very similar to the prior two policies, the finance committee and the subcommittee of the finance committee had done some work on the purchasing policy. So this is just early introduction to the project, and then we'll move on to bring the policy to council with suggested revisions and edits, going through all the process of comment review, edit review, and then ultimately put on council for adoption. But we anticipate that that will be, upwards of 4 meetings, potentially more if needed. Next slide. So this is really hard to read, so I will kind of just tell you. So this is the process is outlined. I'm new to this project, but kind of the elements of the timeline and the philosophy for why we're doing this project from staff input provided to me. So again, I wasn't here for all of it. So the project from certainly the staff perspective is that it started with the state auditor recommending that we update our purchasing policies, so they were out of date. And so that state auditor report came 2018, 2019, I can't quite get a firm date on that. And the state auditor, when they made the recommendation, gave us Lake Stevens as an example. This project then went to the Finance and Administration Committee and then a subcommittee of that committee to take a look, one, at the Lake Stevens policy, but also to take our policy compared to Lake Stevens, but there was also a substantial amount of work to compare to other jurisdictions. And so what ultimately came out was this massive red line that had comments and revisions from a lot of different jurisdictions added as ideas to our purchasing policy. Ultimately, I think the subcommittee from council and staff couldn't quite get to a consensus on what all the revisions should look like. And so we kind of put a pause on the project, and we ended up with an interim purchasing policy that everybody has been working with now, that went through city attorney review. But it's very much an interim. It is not a final project, and it was kind of adopted by consent after a number of back and forth between city attorney, council, and staff. So then when I came in October, this was listed as, sorry, I have a little bit of a bug. As one of the top 10 things for us to do, because again, for approximately 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago, the state auditor told us we needed to do this work and gave a direction to the city that you need to have a finalized adopted purchasing policy. And so it's a priority project. I sent it in December to the city attorney. When I say it, the final revision that the Finance and Administration Committee and staff had is kind of the last touch document that they all revised. I gave that to the city attorney. Daniel and I had multiple meetings about it, and ultimately he could not amend it to a point where it had internal consistencies and had kind of a best practice flow. And so he recommended that we look at the city of Sammamish, who is in the process of adopting a new purchasing manual and use that as a template to modify for the city of Duval. We wanted to get that done in January. It's supposed to go to Sammamish at the end of January. Ultimately, the Sammamish City Council adopted it in the beginning of April, and March, beginning of April. And then Daniel amended it and gave it to us as kind of a template. So that's, again, from the internal staff position, this is how we looked at this timeline and the philosophy of review. Next slide. So I created kind of a touch point for what Daniel and I then did and staff to the Sammamish purchasing manual. So the additions that were made, there was just a lot of kind of specific to Duval, changing names from, to the city administrator to project manager, director of public works. We noted places where the Duval Municipal Code would need to be changed. In 6.4, the director of public works asked for operational efficiency in having 2-year terms for on-call contracts. We made some additions for clarity and context. So in 5.6, the formal bid process, we noted exceptions for emergency work. 5.9, change orders had some revisions. 5.14, the bid deposit, and 5.15, the retainage language changed or got clarified from the Sammamish draft. And then deletions that were made, we made deletions that were duplicative. So where the RCW, or where the Sammamish policy had kind of the entire verbiage of the RCW, we took out and just referred to the RCW. The section on bid issues was removed as potentially conflicting with the bid materials that we issue. So we took that section out. And then there were a couple of deletions that were not consistent with Duval operations. So there are references to an employee handbook. We don't have one of those. A contracts administrator, we don't have those. Reference to federal award standards. We already have our own standalone policy. So we took that section out. And then same with policies on electronic signatures and surplus. We already have our own standalone policies. So those were deleted as well. So that's kind of what we did. I put in the packet as kind of an early view, the red line. So the next slide. So the next steps is the information you need for council to move forward. So Councilmember Naplin sent us an information request. So I wanted to make sure that we go through it here today so I can figure out what you all need to move forward with the project. So one of the requests was something that we were going to do anyway, after this initial presentation, which is to give you the full draft of Sammamish, a compare and contrast document so you can see everything. Council member asked for that. That's an easy add, and we'll be sending that out with the next packet so you can see everything together. The next council request or information request is a comp review. And so you see here what was requested. I tried to create a conservative time estimate of the request. So it's for the cities listed. So it's Sammamish, Gig Harbor, Mukilteo, Woodinville, North Palmy, Sultan, Carnation, Monroe. The following information: the form of government, population, budgeted expenditures, number of employees, a central employee, charge of coordination of purchasing, the signing authority levels, and a link and a copy of the purchasing policy. I tried to be conservative. Of my time, I think it'd be about 18 hours to do this well. Another time spent collecting the information and getting it ready for the packet. And then John would need a fair amount of time to put in each of the contracts into the council packet and link. So if council needs this information to move forward, happy to do it. So that would be the next step is, what does council need to move this agenda item forward so that you all feel like you have the right information to do a review and then potentially get to a place where you can adopt or revise purchasing policy.
Councilmember Sefel, and then.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble reading that. What was that estimate for again?
The time, my estimate of the time it would take to provide the information requested. And my total is about 24.
And well, yeah, what was the information requested? I can't. see.
For Sammamish, Gig Harbor, Mukilteo, Woodinville, North Bend, Snoqualmie, Sultan, Carnation, and Monroe, each of the following: the form of government, population, budgeted expenditures per year, number of employees. Is there a central employee with coordination or oversight responsibilities, purchasing, signing authority levels, and a copy of the purchasing policy?
Why do we need so many? I mean, I think you could get by with just three cities for comparison. Right? I don't see the value in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those are 9 cities that are listed up there.
Yeah,
And I don't see the value in reviewing any, I mean, I don't see what you're gonna get out of that you wouldn't get out of 3.
well, I'm happy to move forward. I mean, my goal really is to make sure that we do in fact move this forward. Because we're years out of having a recommendation to have an adopted purchasing policy. So whatever we need, I just need to know how to move forward.
Councilmember Heflin? Yeah, I just wanna, this was my request, and I feel like, maybe it seems like more work, but I'll just give an example. If I had to answer those questions for Duval, which I did, it took about 5 minutes for me to answer those questions for Duval. So the question would be, is instead of someone trying to research this for each city, if we sent an email to all of these cities we have relationships with. The reason I chose Gig Harbor and Mukilteo is because our attorney is the attorney for those cities. So he has intimate knowledge and connections to those. The rest are all cities we have close ties to. Woodinville, Dana Director Mason worked there. She knows their purchasing policy. All of those cities we have close ties to. And so I feel like if you just sent those survey questions out, which there's really only 2 questions. The first 4 are just perspective of how big are these cities and, you know, things like that. If you don't want to answer those and we just kind of know what these cities are, you can throw out those 4 questions. They're just perspective of what are these cities compared to us. But really the main questions are, do you have a central employee that does purchasing and contracting, and what are your signing authorities? Because what the purchasing or procurement policy is it's council who has the authority by state law and the responsibility to approve purchases and contracting. That is vested in the city council. And so that would be really cumbersome for a council to have to oversee and approve every single contract or purchase. And so using a policy like this, the council is delegating the responsibility to others, to the administration up to a certain threshold. And so when a council does that, they outline expectations of how they want the procurement to occur so that we feel comfortable delegating that responsibility, because by law, that responsibility lies with the council, but it's just not practical. So we're delegating it and we're outlining how we want it to happen. And going back to when the auditor said, hey, you really should update your purchasing policy, I can go find the note, but from my recollection, the comments that they had made about our purchasing and procurement and contracting is that there was a lot of work that was potentially siloed, there wasn't central oversight, and so we needed to get a more robust policy to assure that there was, you know, better oversight of this. And so from my perspective, that's what I heard that we needed. And the thing that is different and why I put that question on there is, for example, that policy came from City of Sammamish. And what did they have to take out to convert it to City of Duval? The contract administrator type position. We don't have this centralized position that oversees compliance and and kind of breaks that silo of purchases happening in different departments and not having oversight in the same way. So anyway, that's why that question is in there. And then, just to find out as we compare, and the reason I chose those cities I already explained, and even though I think maybe 9 sounds like a lot, I don't think it's uncommon to get that many comparisons when you're doing this type of work. Do we need to dig into each purchasing policy? No, that would be a lot to review. I don't think we would want to do that, but just trying to get an understanding of what is a typical signing authority? You know, is this based on having a centralized purchasing department, or a small city often doesn't? And so the oversight falls more on having that last, you know, transparency level of it showing up in the packet on the consent, and council has a chance to look at it. But anyway, I really do think that this could be turned into a survey that we could email to our contacts to each of those communities, and if they don't answer, they don't answer, and whatever we get back, we get back. But I think that was more my intent, not that we would need to go dig up and do public records requests to get purchasing policies and try to dig through it and answer these questions and go research what the population is in the form of government. Like I said, I answered these questions for Duval in less than 5 minutes. And I think other cities could do the same and get put together. And just one more point of reference, it's very, very common that we do policy work, that we do look at quite a few cities, and I'll just use it as an example when we were talking about the utility policy. And, you know, when there is a huge spike in billing, like a leak adjustment, I believe Dana brought back 13 cities. She went and found out what the policy was in 13 different cities and brought it to us in a little grid. I think that's pretty common when we do salary surveys, do any of that work. I can't remember how many cities we had. I mean, I don't know, maybe 15 cities that we looked at to try to get a baseline of what is typical. And so I don't think it's that unusual that you would have a list of cities. And like I said, Dana's most recent, where she was doing some policy work, she went and got 13. And these, like I said, we have relationships with these cities.
So we're gonna let our administrator in, we'll go with Councilwoman Mercer and then back to Councilmember Smith.
So I did review my estimate with the city attorney to figure out whether I was overestimating the time. And he concurred that it's about a 20 to 25 hour project to do well. So it isn't as simple as just emailing cities and getting responses back. If in fact you want the information that is listed in this email, it is a significant body of work. Now, if council needs it to move forward, we can proceed with getting it all, but it is not insignificant. And so I think there's a difference of opinion about how to get this information and what would be involved, and then, you know, getting the links and providing the information requested.
Councilmember Mercer, and then Supple.
Yeah, I sort of comment on the question. The you know, comment is just really in you know, not necessarily drilling on the time requirements required. This is one of those things where I think when we talked about having committees and not having committees, if there was work and it wasn't available for staff, that potentially this is something that could come back to a committee could work through it either through public records or doing some of that outreach. So that might be one way to sort of balance out take it off of staff, but still have it sort of hit some of those points, because some of that will be public record, some will, particularly if it's distilled down, but other things in terms of internal documents potentially would require outreach, which would require time. My question was more just, and it might help frame the need a little bit as well, is there was a comment in the presentation regarding you know, Daniel's review of the original red line document, the sort of challenge with reconciling that into a workable document with sort of business flow, identifying sort of Sammamish in the outline. And I'm assuming there was some due diligence done in terms of the Sammamish document review in terms of, is this the right model? Is this the right fit? Does this, you're even, you know, setting aside the deletions and additions. And it might also help in terms of having that framing, because he may have looked at some of this, particularly knowing that he does work for these other cities in terms of, because that's, I think, the context that I don't have in terms of looking at this is what made Sammamish in Daniel's mind a good fit, and so that might also address, the need to do the additional analysis. But last point is, I do agree that, having some sense or understanding that it's an apples to apples comparison, which is, I think, where Jennifer's coming from a little bit, is just wanting to make sure it's the right fit, and if Daniel's done some of that work, that might address the question as well.
Did you want to answer?
Yeah, so Daniel actually took a look in his office for all the other cities that firm represents and tried to figure out which one best reflected the concepts that were in the draft, as well as the level of detail that our subcommittee wanted in a final policy. And he selected Sammamish because, one, it was going to their council soon, so it was fresh and new and updated. So it wasn't an outdated policy, but also it's extensive. And so one of the considerations from the prior draft was that council really wanted kind of all the I's dotted and T's crossed. There were also areas where the draft had identified real interest that the prior finance committee had in women and minority-owned businesses and some of those equity principles, and Sammamish contained those. And so his thought was that Sammamish offered the best and most complete example to start with.
Councilmember Stoffel?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to go with Sammamish. I mean, this seems like the work has been done, and when I look at that last bullet item, it says link or copy of purchasing policy for 9 cities. You know how big our purchasing manual is? Who's gonna go through basically 1,000 pages of purchasing policy to review it, to compare it to what we have? That's gonna take all year. I mean, that to me is, I don't see how it's even achievable with the resources that we have.
I'm gonna weigh in really
If
quick.
that's what's being asked, that's what's being asked.
Those are typically available online. I mean, you just put.
Yeah,
link to it.
I know.
I wouldn't expect anyone to review it, but sometimes if you're like, well, I wonder what a city
Well,
does on
what
this
good
or
is
that.
it if you request it and then you don't do anything with the information? That's what, someone has to go through it and do a comparison.
I want to just get back to the original question for myself. I didn't weigh in. I see the mayor has her hand up as well, but I think, great to get, the thing you said you're doing anyways, which is the first thing, the red line of Sammamish. In my mind, I think, given the time it takes, a max would be 5 comparables off of this list. I think the list is good. I would pick 5 of them, a minimum. I try and think somewhere between that. I think 3 would be a minimum. I just try and think, I know sometimes all these other cities that do this process are doing the same things, and they've already done some of that work, but it's our due diligence that we have to do to also look at what else is going on, and make sure that, if someone from the community comes up and asks us about it, that we can say, oh, well, here's what we looked at, but also make that point that we got a policy from somewhere that had just done it and they did a similar process. So in my mind, 5 would be an absolute max, just given the time it would take, the estimate. But somewhere between there perhaps, and because I'm trying to also think not just of this policy, but all the other policies that come forward. It's great to have comparables, but at some point you need to draw a line just given our time constraints with staff. So, Mayor, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Protem. And because I just did have surgery today and keep my camera off, but I did want to, for the new council members' benefit, did want to let you know that all of our procurement policy is guided by state law. State law sets the maximum minutes and the basic rules for procurement. And I will note that the city of Duval is significantly under those limits, as are likely most of these cities on the list. So part of the purpose, when you think about our budget, and right now, council has to approve everything over $25,000, even if you approved it in the budget. So, we already have a super low purchasing policy limit. And we are well under what state law allows. So my recommendation would be if there are cities looked at, we look at cities that are actually the most similar to us in size, which would be Woodinville, North Bend, and Snoqualmie. And put the others to the side, especially Carnation, since they are significantly smaller than us. But I am very concerned about the amount of staff time, considering the hundreds, if not thousands of hours that have been worked on this policy over the last 4 years that has not come to fruition yet. So I just wanted to share that thought. So that our new members are aware that this isn't based just on what cities do. We have state law that we are following when this policy is developed. Thank you.
Just wanted to check in, is this your last slide?
It is, yeah, we can, we're finished.
We can leave it up. I just want to double check, because I was like, is this a stopping point? Then we have
This
more.
is the stopping point of what do we need to move forward?
So since this is a first touch, I just want to answer this question for you tonight, and I want to make sure it's clear. I am not 100% sure what consensus I've heard. Councilmember Naplan, and then maybe we just go back around the table one more time and kind of give a firm, here's what I need in regards to this request.
I want to revise my request because it sounds like, I mean, I hear what the mayor's saying, I hear what you're saying and what you're saying, and finding cities that are most similar, Woodinville, North Bend, and Snoqualmie all, are actually significantly have much higher revenues, even though, you know, they're larger, and North Bend, even though they're the same size, has a lot higher revenues, just based on their commercial areas. And then Sultan and Carnation, just for the perspective, so you have some a little bigger and some a little smaller, because we'd probably be in the middle or somewhere in that range. So I think if we want to limit it to 5, the most similar would be, yeah, those 5, Woodinville, North Bend, Snoqualmie, Sultan, and Carnation, just to have a perspective of a couple smaller and 3 bigger. I think that's usually what we try to do when we get comparables. We try to look at a range. So I would revise my request if that was desirable, and I don't need a link or a copy of the purchasing policy because they're all available online. I can just Google it.
Councilmember Mercer?
You know, I would be fine with that, the 3 or the 5. I think you also indicated it was really just the last two bullet points is there essential employee coordination oversight, and then purchasing signing authority levels if that's available. I think you said the others with extraneous information, could even scope it down a little bit more. I think the only other question that I would ask, and you sort of ignore, because I think you provided some background in terms of Daniel's analysis, but to an earlier point that Jennifer made was just at the end of the day, if we did move forward with this sort of sandwich policy, does it address the core points that were initially raised from the state auditor? That's the one piece I assume that was part of Daniel's analysis. It wasn't explicitly stated, but if it was in fact, you know, lack of oversight versus policy, that's a different conversation, because that's actually sort of a resource or a structure within the city versus the policy that wraps around that. But if you could clarify that, but I don't know if that helps you, but otherwise I think I'm fine with, yeah, something more than nothing, but not necessarily doing the 9.
And I can also have Daniel, present kind of his analysis without getting into the, kind of different legal questions. I mean, I think he'd be happy to spend 5 or 10 minutes.
Typically we have another touch and we're.
Yeah, I mean, multiple touches of this. I think he'd be happy to kind of explain what he got, why he didn't think it was usable, and then the approach he took.
Yeah, and then I would just chime in and then we'll go to you, Mike. I think I'm fine with that. Those city top 3 for me are Woodinville, North Bend, and Snoqualmie. You know, it's always tough because we have different metrics, right? And so some are more similar in some ways and others in others. So it's hard to know which ones to choose always, but I can provide some balanced perspective. And then did I hear from you, Ron, that like the last 3 bullet points on that, the information, because other stuff, I mean.
Yeah, I think Jennifer actually indicated the last one she could get was really the second to last 2, that is there a central it's really about, is there central signing authority
Right.
for that city and then the purchasing levels? So really-
Yeah, see, I mean, I just wanna add to, I mean, anything as individuals, it's important to figure out what the group wants as a whole, and then anything above and beyond that we want, I mean, we're free to go do as well, so. What did you think about this?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's just a phone call would answer that question, you know? Is there a central employee with the, what's that, coordination oversight? You know, phone call answer that question to a couple of these cities, do you really need to send something out? And Jennifer indicated that the purchasing policies are online.
Yeah, I mean, the purchasing and signing authorities, I'll have to go into each of the purchasing policies that we get, because usually there's a chart, like our annual policy has a chart of all of that. But it can be found and dissected.
But then again, I don't see the value in having more than 3 cities, it's just, you know, analysis by paralysis, is basically what's gonna happen when you throw in 5, 7, or 9 cities, it's just gonna, you're gonna spend your time churning your wheels.
All right, before I go to you again, I just wanted to say, like, does that give you, I mean, there's only 4 of us here, but we are majority, so. And I know we wanna keep things moving too, so I'd hate to wait any further, and there will be opportunity to weigh in again. Did you have something else? or-
Yeah, the reason I think it's important to have some smaller cities like Sultan and Carnation is those cities do not have as many employees. They're in Woodinville, North Bend, and Snohomish have much larger staff and have some of those things to provide oversight that we do not have. And so I think the perspective of a smaller city that might not have some of those things is a good perspective to have. So that's why I was including those other 2 cities. And I agree, a phone call off the top of the, if you called the finance director in any of these cities, you'd have a easy 5-minute, you know, just to answer those questions, would just take a second. So yes, phone call, email, whatever.
Oh, I have one more request, can we have a minimum font size?
Yeah.
Better than squinty.
Even if it requires 2 sides.
Yeah. We can do that.
Right, did you need anything else from us yet on this then?
I don't think so, the mayor.
Oh, I thought it was still, Mayor, did you have something else, or was your hand just still left up?
I have nothing else. It doesn't show on my end that my hand's up, so my apologies.
No worries.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the direction and I have enough guidance to move forward. Thank you.
And then one quick last question for you. I know we were talking about how, you know, after this discussion, we'd send you edits, input. Do you want that anytime? Do you want to wait till you get back to us with the information, or I don't know what would make it easier on you, or if you have a preference?
I mean, if you have, so you all are professionals and can read a purchasing policy independent of a comp review. So if you read it and you have initial thoughts on, oh, I like this, but want to see it different. And so, I mean, you all probably have your own independent ideas without seeing other people's work. And if you want to send me your thoughts, I can incorporate it into a draft now, but I'll certainly send Samamish's raw, recently adopted policy, and I'll have Daniel convert or redline. So you can all see what the differences are. But if you want to start sending me comments, I can start doing a build draft now.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Well, thank you for that. Okay, so our last item is discussion on mid-year retreat with council, and this is with me. So I just wanted to check in. We usually have 2 retreats per year, so I don't need to make our decisions tonight. I just wanted a sense so we could start planning something. Traditionally, historically, there is a retreat in January, which is usually figuring out like committee assignments, looking at goals, because usually you'd be coming right after passing the budget. And so since we're in biennial budget, it's a little different now. Usually the mid-year would be looking, it would be like that pre-budget retreat where we all get together. But now again, that we're in, you know, a biennial budget, we don't necessarily need to have the same needs. So if you guys have a sense of, well, first off, the timing. I think it used to be like January and June or April, I don't know, it was something like that. It was like pre-budget. But last year we did it more in the fall, if I recall, I think. My memory's a little hazy. So I don't know if you have strong opinions on timing of year, something that would be beneficial. Our second retreat of last year was with a facilitator who did that team building stuff, because also that might also be, who do you want at the retreat? You know, is this a retreat that we would invite directors to, in addition to, of course, the city administrator and mayor? So I don't know, I just wanted to get a sense of if you guys had ideas on what you'd like to see, so that I can start taking notes and throwing some things together and. Yeah, go ahead.
So my preference would be, just because I have a lot of things going on, to do it later in the summer, but while the weather's still nice. There were activities, things that we did where with the, whether it's here or at a location, I think there's benefits to having a little nicer weather if we're doing things engaging with the town. The other sort of thing, with some of the new, and this sort of undercuts that point, the only reason I would think about having earlier, other than the topics, it might be an opportunity to engage with some of the new staff that are coming on. So I'm kind of talking against myself a little bit in some ways, and sort of prefer that later. But obviously we have new folks that are joining staff that we don't have a lot of, haven't had past interactions. Their new role is an opportunity to provide sort of feedback and directional, so it might make sense there as well. So that's sort of two countervailing points of view. I just know that the middle of the summer, June it doesn't really work at all. So it would need to be July, August, just with kids going off to college and other travel and activities, not available.
Yeah, I agree, and for planning purposes too, that's why I'm thinking,
Yeah.
well, we need to start the conversation now.
Not much lead time.
It's already halfway through May, basically. Any other ideas though on like, I don't know, trainings or, again, did you like the facilitator we worked with last time? I know they kind of work with people on schedules, so they might bring something slightly different or cater something to us. So anyways, or you just haven't thought about it much and maybe you guys need more time to think about it. All right, well, that helps get us started. I think that I just had a few things. I like that too, the late summer, early fall, maybe while it's still nice out that way. If you take a break and you go out, it is nice, with new staff. I don't know that they'd be full on in a retreat with us, but maybe we have that. I've been trying to get to this point of having like a pre-social retreat thing, like if it's on a Saturday, Friday night campfire or something like that. And that would be a great time to meet new staff too. And I'm sure they'll come to cows as well, but.
Actually, one follow-up question, actually it's for city administrator. I know one of the things we talked about doing at the last offsite, which we didn't do, we had other things to talk about, was something around sort of the Jurassic Parliament training.
Oh, yeah.
And I wasn't sure if that didn't manifest because of scheduling and timing or cost, but I know you get too into that, it's a little dry, but there might be, again, an opportunity, because that is a topic we talked about revisiting and just in terms of putting more structure in place. But
Yeah, I think last time the schedule just didn't work with her.
No, that wasn't the issue. The issue
Oh.
was the group, she was only willing to give us a group rate for something that was extremely basic, and I'm not.
So which is also fair.
Yeah.
I mean, we can find something else, but, I think you all would have, probably not gained a lot from it.
Yeah, and sometimes you could, if it wasn't, even if it wasn't a part of a retreat and we wanted to do that training, you could reach out to neighboring cities and host it and they pay into it, they pay a fee to come and then it's like a bigger thing, so, yeah, go ahead.
I know, the state auditor and, even MRSC sometimes will offer these things for low or no cost. I know the state auditor had something, it was like strengths finders or something like that, where they come in and they do that for free and we can provide all the materials. So, there are opportunities to get certain kind of trainings and things at no cost. And I haven't researched it recently, but at one point I have. So, and yeah, joining in with another city actually could be super fun too. I was like, getting to know some of the neighboring elected, so maybe something like that. The Jurassic Parliament or something like that.
All right. Well, I'll check back in on this then when we have the rest of council as well. So with that, we'll go ahead, if there's no objections, we'll adjourn at 7:41. Thanks, everyone.
And if you have your computers and are willing to leave them with me, we will have them updated and give them back to you. Otherwise, it's week.
Yeah, right. And then
I'm gonna bring my next week because I'm meeting tomorrow, I mean, it'd be helpful to have my computer.
Right.
Security updates and